Welcome back to another video with Scruffy Tales. And in this video we will go back to World War II and more specifically the Winter War, when a Swedish company of soldiers saw battle against an entire battalion of Soviet troops. Now, the Winter War was, of course, the war fought between the Soviet Union and Finland between the 30th of November 1939 and the 13th of March 1940. The Soviet Union invaded Finland completely unprovoked, trying to, or rather intent on conquering the country. But Finland, despite being outgunned and outnumbered, managed to fight back, quite incredibly so, and inflicted insane amounts of casualties on the Soviet forces, which of course resulted in the Soviet Union failing in conquering Finland. And in the end, they only managed to occupy and eventually conquer roughly 10% of the country. This was a conflict that Sweden did get involved in, contrary to what people usually say about the matter. The army and the Swedish population were very much in favor of helping Finland. Swedish government, on the other hand, well, they wanted to help, but they didn't want to get Sweden drawn into the war. So they had to come up with a sneaky way to manage it all. So Sweden's solution was to arrange for the Swedish population to gather charity to raise funds in order to give it to Finland, so that Finland in turn could then use those funds to purchase equipment and weapons and ammunition from Sweden so that they could use it in the war against the Soviets. At the same time, Sweden allowed volunteers to join the Finnish army. And as it happens, a lot of those volunteers were Swedish soldiers or citizens that had done conscription. But not only that, it also included 500 career officers from the Swedish army that were allowed to go on leave in order to join this volunteer force. So now you had some 500 Swedish army officers in charge of 9,000 troops, of which there were also 700 Norwegian volunteers, one should add. And they were equipped with weapons from the Swedish army, bought and purchased by Finland using the money they had been given through Swedish charity. So as you can see, a thinly veiled attempt by Sweden to get involved in the conflict without officially sending in the army. There was even a Swedish artillery company that was set up in the same fashion that was also deployed to Finland. So a Swedish artillery company, complete with guns and everything, was put together and shipped over to Finland, just as this massive infantry unit of roughly 9,500 troops. And while the artillery company was deployed to the south of Finland, the infantry was deployed to the north, as you can see by the circle. And they were sent in to relieve Finnish troops, so the Finnish troops could be moved south to fight the onslaught in the south, and the Swedes were supposed to help the Finns hold the line up in the north. Not only that, Sweden also deployed a full third of its air force to Finland, and it was done in the same way. You had funds gathered through charity in Sweden, and Finland used those funds to purchase aircraft, ammunition, fuel, and everything. But Finland didn't only get the aircraft or ammunition and fuel, they also got the pilots and the ground crew from Sweden. So Sweden more or less deployed a third of its air force to Finland in order to fight the Soviet Union. So just like with the artillery and with the infantry, you had the air force being deployed to Finland with this very thin excuse of it's all volunteers and Finland actually bought all the equipment. When in reality, Sweden deployed the army and the air force to Finland using bullshit arguments in order to stay out of the war, but unofficially sending in troops, equipment, artillery, and aircraft to fight the Soviet Union. So this is the background to the events that would later on become known as the Grafström raid, Grafströmska räden in Swedish. So the Swedish infantry unit, 9,500 troops, had been moved into Finland and relieved Finnish troops on the front line. And the Swedish troops, they were constantly hit by enemy artillery, they were constantly attacked by enemy aircraft. And the Swedes eventually, they figured we need to counterattack, we can't just sit here and take it, we need to take the fight to the enemy. So they needed to send out reconnaissance in order to find out where the Soviets were set up and how their supply lines worked. The man put in charge of this reconnaissance mission was Lieutenant Anders Grafström, and he was given 93 Jaegers who were supposed to go out on a 3-day mission in order to gather intelligence on Soviet positions and how the Soviet supply lines worked. Now remember, this is in the middle of winter in the north of Finland, the 1st of March 1940, and it is about 20 degrees below freezing during the day and 30 below freezing during the night. So, in the cover of darkness, the Swedish Jaegers set out from Swedish positions on the front line and decided to take a long way, a long detour up north to avoid Soviet troops, and set out on a 9-hour ski march through the wilderness in knee-deep snow in order to avoid detection. Early in the morning of the 2nd of March, they find a small hill out on a big open field where they decide this is a good place to set up camp. It is easily defended, and from here we can send out patrols to scout the Russians. So they move in on the hill from the north, crossing the open fields, and set up base camp. And what they do is set up 2 large tents where they all can fit in, and they start heating up food and hot water and all that, and begin to rest after this long, arduous march on skis through the snow in 30 below freezing. And they also begin to prepare defenses. And in order to do that, they create basically trench lines in the snow that allows them to quickly move back and forth across this hill without having to walk through knee-deep, waist-deep snow all the time. So they have these lanes, trench lines that they can just run back and forth, reaching firing positions as needed if they would come under fire. And as soon as the camp was prepared, and as soon as they were happy with their defensive positions and having dug all the trench lines they needed in the snow, it was time to scout out the enemy, and they deployed a 9-man squad to initiate reconnaissance. So during the morning hours of the 2nd of March, a 9-man squad set out into the woods on their skis to locate Soviet positions and gather intelligence. However, it did not go according to plan. The squad was detected and came under fire and had to return fire in order to pull out of the kill zone. This fight continued for little more than an hour, around an hour, where the Swedes had to defend themselves against Soviet troops following them through the snow. And in the end, 3 Swedes were captured, 4 were killed, and only 2 of the Swedes managed to escape this disastrous reconnaissance mission. The 2 survivors managed to get back to base camp and obviously report back what had happened, and the Swedes were now aware that the Russians were onto them, and that the Russians knew that there were Swedish troops behind enemy lines. A couple of hours later, 1 or 2 hours later, the Swedes noticed a Soviet unit of around 60 men crossing a open area of the woods to their northeast. The Russians were following the Swedish trail, the ski trail that the patrol had used. And as the Russians moved in north of the Jaeger base camp, they came across the main Swedish trail that the Swedes had used during the night to cross the open field. The Swedish Jaegers were obviously aware that they had Russians to their north, and they knew that they had followed the patrol's trail out of camp, and that they now had found the main trail leading to the camp, crossing the open fields. So the Swedish Jaegers got into position, got into their prepared defensive positions, and just waited for the Russians to emerge out of the forest to the north of their hill. The Russians did not commit fully and only sent across a small unit to scout what would happen. And the Swedes lay in wait, knowing that as soon as they opened fire, all hell would break loose. And the Russians followed the Swedish trail towards the hill, and when they were close enough, the Swedes gave the order and opened fire, and they shot every Russian out in the open dead right there and then. Obviously, the main Russian unit to the north responded in full and opened fire on the hill and the Swedish positions. It quickly escalated into a massive shootout between the Russians and the Swedes, and the time is now around 1300 hours, 1 o'clock. And the Swedes are in a good position up on their hill, and the Russians are in the snow trying to shoot up at the Swedes, which means that the Russians are having trouble aiming properly as they're taking cover in the deep snow. So most of the Russian shots are going high, missing Swedish positions. But even if the Swedes had the upper hand at this point, having good positions, firing down into Russian lines, and the Russians are really struggling trying to land shots on the Swedes, things were about to change, and it was about to change quickly. And the Swedes would soon find themselves in real trouble. Because it didn't take long for another unit of Russians to arrive. Around 70 Russians came in from the east and set up shop along the tree line and opened fire on the Swedish hill. So the Swedes were now at first outflanked on the north and to the east, and Russians quickly sent some troops into the south as well. So now the Swedes were outflanked on 3 sides, taking shots from all over the place. But again, the Swedes had good position on the hill, and the Russians, they had trouble in the snow trying to aim properly at the Swedish positions, having to shoot upwards while being in knee-deep, waist-deep snow. So the Russians really struggled to land shots properly on the Swedish positions, while the Swedes had no issues firing downwards into the tree line where the Russians were hiding. The Swedes still had the upper hand, but it was quickly turning into Russian favor. As the fighting continued, more and more Russian troops joined in on the fight, and soon enough the Russians had gathered a force of around 400 soldiers, and they had now moved to surround the Swedes to the west, to the east, and to the south, and having abandoned their positions to the north. And the shooting continued for another 2 hours, at which point another force of around 50 Russian troops arrived. And an hour later, the Russians received even more reinforcements, another 150 troops. So all in all, some 600 Soviet soldiers had been deployed in order to deal with the Swedish Jaegers that had begun this mission with 93 soldiers. At around 1800 hours, 6 o'clock, the Swedes could see that the Russians were repositioning to the south, moving basically everything they had almost to the south of their position, obviously gathering for a large assault. To the south of the Swedish positions, the Russians could avoid the big open fields and rely on cover all the way up to the hill, so it made sense for Russians to attack from this position. To make matters worse, the Swedes were running low on ammunition at this point. And the Swedes knew that they could not hold against a decisive push from the Soviets if they came from the south, where they could rely on cover and where they could concentrate their firepower to pin the Swedes in place and force the Swedes to duck for cover. Having almost no ammunition left, the Swedish Jaegers had no choice. They fixed bayonets and they filled their pockets with hand grenades. 2 flares launched by the Russians signaled the Soviet assault, and the Russian war cries echoed over the Finnish forest. But the Russian war cries were instantly met by Swedish voices roaring in defiance. As the Russians attacked, the Swedes called out their own war cries and counterattacked straight into the incoming Soviets. The Swedes met the Russians in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the waist-deep snow, relying on bayonets and hand grenades. They fought their way through the Russian formations and eventually fought the Russians in the Soviet positions. 2 sergeants, Bertil Molin and Hilding Vara, stood out in the chaos of the fight as they relentlessly engaged the Soviets at point-blank range with their submachine guns, so much so that they were afterwards credited as being instrumental in eventually forcing the enemy to retreat. The Swedes relied on submachine guns, bayonets, and hand grenades, and using whatever they could find in order to beat back the Soviets and kill them in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, the Soviet formations were beaten, broken apart, and the Russians fled in disarray. When the battle was over, after some 5 hours of hard fighting, only 6 Swedes had died. The Russians had lost closer to 200 men. The Swedes had begun with 93 troops, and the Russians had deployed almost 600 soldiers in order to defeat the Swedish Jaegers. Outgunned and outnumbered, and with no ammunition left, the Swedish Jaegers had to rely on the bayonet in the end to secure victory. And like the Swedish soldiers of the Karelian army in the 18th century, the Jaegers relied on the charge straight into the enemy lines in order to win the battle. With the battle over, the Jaegers broke camp and made their escape, bringing their wounded with them, but forced to leave their dead behind. They marched through the night in minus 30 degrees, and on the morning of the 3rd of March, they eventually returned to Swedish positions, able to report back on the battle they had fought. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video interesting. I know I was amazed when I first learned about this battle and the way the Swedish Jaegers conducted themselves in this very difficult situation, outnumbered 6-1 more or less, and being out of ammunition and forced to rely on the bayonet and countercharge through snow in order to survive and win the battle. Simply amazing. And why this has never been made into a movie, I don't know. This really deserves to be retold properly to the Swedish population. Just as the mission of JDEX 1 during the Congo crisis. I don't know why Swedish filmmakers have shunned away from these heroic battles where Swedish troops have taken part in. Anyway, this is all I have for you in this video. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you in the next one.